Souls on FM radio, Kernel station, whatever we are on today. I'm gonna cut the song a little bit short because I want us to have as much time as we can with the wonderful Kia Kreutler, who is one of the leaders for the DAOs and Dragons Guild. She's been with us for multiple guilds at this point, and we've made many memories through the process, and I have learned more about the history and future and perhaps present of DAOs from Kia, probably more than I've learned about DAOs from anyone else. And it's partially because I think the definitions that she's using are rooted in language that is quite different from whatever the current paradigm is. It starts and continues through threads that are much longer stories. And I really won't do too much more introducing, because there's a presentation that Kia is going to go through that's going to be about 30 minutes, maybe more, 40 minutes perhaps. And we are going to have to keep today's session to an hour. So we'll probably have 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Kia to speak about DAOs. Thank you so much.
Thank you for such the warm intro as always, Vivek. And hello, nice to see everybody. I love when the guilds start kicking off and everybody comes. It's such an exciting time. So for this initial session, I'm going to be a little bit more didactic than usual and just do a presentation. We'll have about 15 or more minutes at the end for questions, any things you want to talk about that could be related to the presentation or just kind of any thoughts you have more broadly. The presentation loosely follows an essay I wrote last year called A Prehistory of DAOs. But as usual in this space, things move so quickly, I'm feeling the need to almost write a sequel soon, so I will be. But I'll still lay it out like it is in the essay and with a few little tweaks here and there. And basically what it is a kind of trying to connect DAOs with different lineages than they've maybe been connected through more kind of technical writers or through different political slants. And so it describes some DAOs rather than DAOs as a general category. And it also tries to connect to lineages that may not be like favorable, but are definitely within the lineage of DAOs, because I believe that it's easier to change lineages that we're aware of. And I'm also in the States right now, still a little bit jet lagged, just went for a run, so I'm a little sleepy, but I'll be going a little slower than usual, but feel free to just kind of accumulate questions in the chat and I'll kind of check them at the end. So I'll just share my screen in a minute. Let's see. All right, can y'all see my first slide?
We can, yes.
Great. So a prehistory of DAOs, cooperatives, gaming guilds, and the networks to come. So I think of DAO as a chimeric term, and chimeric is this kind of mythological term of a creature that's composed of several different creatures kind of come together. The term stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization. And as I say, it comes from imagining how features of decentralized software or technology or decentralized compute, such as global digital assets, censorship resistance, and automated actions will change how organizations operate. A perhaps kind of more publicly accessible way to describe DAOs is simply as internet native organizations. So the thought of deploying a contract and having it be representative of an organization in some way. And I would just say also the term smart contracts often has been kind of maligned slightly because it implies the existence of a legal contract in some way through software, but that is not the case. And as we see with more and more DAOs today, that is not the case. So when I say a contract here, it's going towards the legal rather than implying the legal. And so the history. In 2016, the the first DAO launched, but the term appeared a bit earlier in 2014 in the Ethereum community. It was originally kind of around the term of decentralized autonomous corporation or decentralized autonomous company that was circulating in kind of Bitcoin and early blockchain discussion places. But through the Ethereum community, the kind of term more general purpose DAO came to be. And so the first experiment bearing its name, the DAO, launched as a decentralized funding organization in 2016. And it raised over 150 million in Ether at the time. And it was kind of set up to be something like a decentralized funding vehicle. However, sadly, as many of us know now, the experiment proved short-lived. The DAO was hacked 1 month after launch. And basically what ensued was a mini DAO winter that many of us kind of kept going through. And so there's a whole kind of DAO history and timeline that I think has receded into the background, but from things like Aragon and DAO Stack, which Aragon's still around, but different. DAO Stack was a platform with a lot of different parameters of how you could run an organization. There's many instances of these. There was also Moloch DAO, which is now, you might know better as DAO House, Summons, and then things like Metacartel, Raid Guild, Metafactory, Compound coming and running a protocol like DAO, Snapshot, Flamingo DAO. Basically, there's a whole rich history in there that now feels a little bit ancient given how things quickly move. And I would say that DAOs, while having many instances in the wild, also are the kind of often like a vessel for the imagination or a vessel for different projections. So I think every generation tends to have at least one, if not several, organizational forms in which they project kind of current failings of society and basically the ability to amend them through this new organizational form. So the most kind of common to us probably being the commune of, like, say, the last century. And now a kind of small niche of us have DAOs, where we have these kind of qualities that are both real and unreal. There's something kind of amidst the imaginary and the collective imagination of what DAOs are. So things like autopoietic, self-making, illegal, not in the sense that they're illegal, but that in the sense that they establish new precedents as they grow. There's also the idea of organization as executable, the idea it's a kind of executable software file, an organization in a program. There's an idea that DAOs are co-owned, so you have co-owned membership from the start. And there's also an idea, which I find actually the most interesting, that DAOs are a type of particularly mnemonic institution. So mnemonic means kind of the memory or memory making. So it's the idea that institutions basically can encode their actions either publicly or through zero knowledge proofs as they act them. So the idea that the decision of an organization is automatically kind of encoded in its memory in some way for its organizational members to look back and view. So a kind of mnemonic organization where its very act is creating a memory or a vestige or an archive of what it does. And yeah, there's a lot of questions around what kind of memories DAOs produce, and especially given the last couple of months in the Ethereum space, how public those memories should be, and the questions of accountability are an ethical space that we'll really be encountering over the next year. But I would say that while the term DAO is new and kind of a vehicle for these imaginations, the ideas behind it aren't, both for better and for worse. So there's this term networks, which was like a beloved term of think tanks in the last century, and particularly relevant to the 1995 RAND report called Tribes, Institutions, Markets, Networks. In the report, it basically gave a really grand narrative schematic of how you could think of different human organizational forms evolving over time. So saying that we kind of started with tribes onto more hierarchical institutions, then we have markets, then we have networks. And the argument presented in the report is not that one replaced the other, but as a new form evolved, it basically came back and added new functionalities and also diminished some functionalities of the previous form. So in the way that markets both expanded state function, but also curtailed forms of competition, curtailed forms of competition within the state and creating new arenas for competition outside of it. And of particular relevance to us, of course, is the idea of the network. So what is the idea of the network in terms of this RAND report? So I would say a key distinguishing feature from organizational forms preceding it, networks are described as multi-organizational in the report. And they facilitate the growth of distributed web-like global enterprises and increasingly so-called virtual corporations. This is 1995. And also, neither public nor private, the primary domain of multi-organizational networks is a third autonomous social sector, which the report identifies as civil society. So things like NGOs or kind of nonprofit sector. And I think it's really important to highlight DAOs in the lineage of this report, because I think whether we know it or not, this lineage has subconsciously affected us. So from the popular piece, Squad Wealth, we have this diagram of the Paleolithic squad to today. If we go back to the report, we have a kind of similar vibe of the exact same diagram. And it appears with the report's emphasis on civil society's 3-letter acronyms for organizations, so NGOs, NPOs, and PVOs, which are private voluntary association. A future one seems conspicuously missing, so DAOs. And I bring this up because as DAOs situate themselves along this hegemonic path, making this connection is important, because it's much more difficult to alter the course of lineages of which you aren't aware. So RAND comes from a lineage of basically kind of informatizing kind of military endeavors from the US. It was originally founded as a nonprofit think tank that is still around today that advises US military and industry. So this idea of kind of networks and virtual corporations is not an innocent one, nor is it some kind of pure utopian ideal that is often presented in kind of early discourse on the internet. But it's very important that we realize that we have inherited this discourse from a place that has complex and not always great kind of connotations, so that we're more aware of the language that we're using and how to change it in the future. So thinking of DAOs in 2021 and beyond, so a proposed definition for a type of DAO in the slide is that some might be best described as voluntary associations with the operating principles of digital cooperativism. So as voluntary associations, they're a cross-jurisdictional way for strangers, friends, or unlikely allies to pseudonymously come together toward shared goals. And usually they're supported by a token model, some form of incentives, and governance held in common. And why I say that they embrace the operating principles of digital cooperativism is because there isn't a one-to-one match between DAOs and co-ops. Most co-ops have one member, one vote, or sometimes in certain cases, if it's like, say, a producer co-op where you're producing something within a particular industry, if certain producers who belong to the co-op have a higher production output than others, or kind of a higher stake within the organization, they may have greater governance power. But for the most part, co-ops are one member, one vote. And instead, I think that DAOs kind of aim towards this distribution of ownership from the start, and we'll talk about it more later. But I would say, this is why I say that they embrace the operating principles of digital cooperatives rather than our cooperatives from the get-go. And a great quote from Ava Berlin is that basically DAOs are not products, they're frameworks for decision-making about products and projects. If your DAO is successful, you shouldn't even know it's there. It'll just be a well-functioning community. I think this is true and not true. I tend to like to emphasize this quote because too often there's a kind of fetish of governance tooling that gets in the way of what people actually want to do together. So if we can think about DAOs initially as kind of a roughly aligned, rough consensus group towards a roughly common goal, we're less likely to get stuck in kind of governance fetishism about the protocols and platforms we're using. And the DAO landscape today, that said, it's important to be kind of concrete about the tools that we're using and the DAOs in operation. It's really grown, and this graphic is from over a year ago in 2021. So there's even more, and but also probably some of these don't exist anymore either. So it goes both ways. It's just a highly evolving linguistic and soft and technical space. And so in 2021, based on these DAOs from the last screen, you could think of DAOs as software tooling that's been described as a group chat and a bank account. And today, this still generally takes the form of a Discord server and a Gnosis-safe multisig. And the Gnosis-safe multisig, I'll show you in a second, it's basically a Web3 platform for creating joint accounts. And so I think a lot of us are familiar with Discord and Slack. So basically just a multi-channel chat room. So it's a DAO could be described as this plus a multisig. And this is also a slightly outdated interface. I really recommend everybody to check out the new interface. It's great. But Gnosis Safe multisigs are basically, and this is pictured the Uniswap grants multisig. So basically on view to the community where people can publicly make requests for funding. And the idea behind a multisig is, so it's multi-signature, multiple signatures can manage the account. In the safe, this, for example, in the Uniswap safe here, this looks like 4 out of 6 owners own the account. So this means there are 6 distinct Ethereum addresses that are given full permission over the account. But in order to send a transaction or change permissions on the account, 4 of those 6 addresses have to sign and confirm a transaction. So what you have here is something that starts looking a little bit like a board of directors having to do a majority vote, but there's no limitation on what those addresses represent. 2 of those addresses could represent 1 person. You know, as we get into ecological sensor networks, maybe they represent a biodiversity index of an ecosystem. Won't go fully there, but it's a kind of agnostic way for having a group joint account. And I don't know if any of you have tried to set up joint accounts before, but as for a company or for otherwise. So it's quite hard to do it with people who aren't, well, basically impossible to do it with people who aren't in your jurisdiction. And then also incredibly hard, even if you share the same jurisdiction, to do a kind of joint bank account. It takes a lot of paperwork, takes a lot of time. You have to present a lot of funding up front often. And basically this, you can create a Gnosis safe in about a minute, set it up there. And also full disclosure, I work at Gnosis. I contributed to the safe from the early days. The safe team, the multisig safe team, has just spun out and created their own foundation and DAO. So if you're interested in this type of thing, definitely go get involved. I stand to not profit from anything that I'm saying here. So just to clarify. And basically, the reason also why I feel it's so important to mention the safe is that it's really used across the ecosystem for a bunch of different contexts, because it's really become basic infrastructure, even more so than a product. So here pictured is Pleaser DAO, which was a really interesting group that spun up last year because one of their favorite artists, People Pleaser, was doing a NFT sale to fund an organization, and basically knowing that a lot of people couldn't kind of outcompete the whale or the person who had a lot of funds to bid on the NFT auction, a group of people came together, pooled funds in a safe, and started bidding on the auction and won. So this kind of rapid coordination happened within a couple hours of the auction. And then the group stayed together after winning the initial auction and went on to continue collecting different artworks from artists they like, also to benefit good causes. So for instance, they went on to actually purchase the Edward Snowden NFT that was being auctioned to go towards Tor project and private software. And basically what they did, they came together, they won these auctions, and then they issued an internal token to members of the multisig and people who had contributed funds, and set up a snapshot space. So a snapshot space is a voting space for basically token voting. You can do it weighted on the number of coins you have. You could also do it based on NFTs. You could do it with things like Bright ID. So it's not just token voting, although it kind of its initial impetus came from just kind of direct token voting. And here they're voting on whether to acquire the Tor NFT, so the Bloom and Onion NFT, which they voted unanimous yes, and they went on to win. This is how they do kind of internal governance back then. And I find it really interesting because the thing that got me most excited about Pleaser DAO was actually that they usually invited the artists whose works they collected to become part of the organization in turn. So they invited People Pleaser to actually become a member of the DAO. And my background is actually as an artist, and I think that one of the most interesting and potentially fruitful patterns or kind of cultural norms that could come from this is that it's very rare that you see the kind of collector, curator, artist, institution divide broken. So thinking about an artist actually becoming a member of the collection and having a stake in that collection is very different from their work being collected. So I think while Pleaser DAO, I think, went on to do things that I'm less excited about now, I still think that initial cultural norm is really important. And I would say that there's opportunity here because most DAOs represent governance rights through a token. In some sense, they could potentially Trojan horse principles of cooperatives directly into highly financialized spaces by basically making member worker ownership a norm from the start. So things like having artists they collect become part of the collective. And while this, it could look on one side like a publicly traded company, if the cultural norms are strong enough, there is a real incentive to have it from the start, because usually the trajectory is employees wait for a cliff, maybe there's a public offering, maybe it's acquired, maybe a major stake is bought by another corporation. Here you have the ability to change those norms and make them more equitable and also more accessible from the very beginning. But tokenization itself is not a kind of panacea, nor is it 100% kind of the answer. I would say that for DAOs with the mission of economic value creation, a token does become a useful mechanism on three fronts. In terms of bootstrapping funding. So you have your typical kind of token raise, but you could explore things like capped returns for more equitable funding and less Ponzi-like. And also operating across jurisdictional borders. It's, as I mentioned before, for anyone who's tried to do a joint bank account across jurisdictions, it's incredibly hard. And also for coordinating larger scales, basically by simply spinning up a kind of multi-sig and asking for funds and getting a group together, Pleaser DAO was able to win the very first auction and win most of the auctions they participated in very quickly. It would be very hard to do this without some sort of signaling mechanism like the token provides. But I would say, because it is a highly financialized space and kind of fractionalization is the norm, as a guiding star, these applications could aim to introduce value in relations which have been historically denied it, such as labor and environment, rather than creating new financialized relations. So this is something you could keep in mind as you go on throughout the guilds and throughout the kernel program as well. And cooperatives. So what is it about cooperatives and this kind of ability to Trojan horse the idea of cooperatives into financialization that is useful? And what is it about the kind of operating principles of digital cooperatives that I see potentially amenable to DAOs? So in 1844, this little society of weavers in the UK in Rochdale came together and defined 8 principles for their cooperative. These were voluntary and open membership, democratic member control, member economic participation, autonomy and independence, education, training, and information. Perhaps most interestingly, cooperation among cooperatives. So you get the seeds of things like worker federation co-ops or Mondragon from the beginning, as well as concern for community. And you could easily see these operating principles becoming incorporated in DAO communities from the start. And the way that cooperative principles have kind of come to most clearly intersect with the DAO space is through the works of people like Nathan Schneider and the platform cooperativism movement. And in 2019, Nathan published this piece called Exit to Community, where he outlines a kind of third way for companies to go. So rather than doing an IPO and selling publicly traded stocks, and rather than doing corporate acquisition, where basically the company is acquired and gutted for parts, there's another way where a company could basically share the value of what they've created with the people who value it most. So often an example would be a kind of giving ownership of Twitter to the, I wouldn't say the most prolific Twitter users, but you could have different metrics by which people who've deeply invested in the protocol and care about its future are able to steward its future, whether it's things like maybe decreasing the reliance on the advertising model. Maybe it's making the algorithm public. Maybe it's kind of allowing people to tune their own algorithms transparently. So basically allowing the users to decide what is the best route for the protocol to go. Of course, it doesn't always necessarily mean it will be better. But it is interesting to note like how cooperatives have entered the DAO discourse, but also potentially how DAOs could kind of come into the cooperative discourse as well. So there's a great paper by Morshed Manon called Fostering Worker Cooperatives with Blockchain Technology. And in the paper, he highlights basically 3 common dilemmas that cooperatives face. So this is often fundraising for startup costs. There's often limitations on how cooperatives can fundraise, sometimes for the best, like there's limits to how much you can privately fundraise, how much you can fundraise from one individual. But there are ways, but also these things in turn make investors less likely to come and invest in a cooperative because of these limitations and also the cap on profits. If there was a more transparent and easier way to do it, this might change this norm. Also, cooperatives often face dilemma when they govern across borders. So this is the jurisdictional issues again of how do you make a kind of one company formation interoperate with another in a different jurisdiction. Often there's not seamless integration and also just a huge operational overhead when this happens. And similarly, that was the kind of operational side, but also the cultural side of how do you maintain coherence while growing? How do you make sure that kind of all members of the cooperative are pulled in a way that is meaningful and fair? And also just kind of how do you retain shared cultural norms across different places and time and infrastructures? And I would say that DAO patterns actually do offer some kind of reprieve to some of these things in terms of bootstrapping initial funding, easily having the infrastructure to operate across jurisdictions, and coordinating at larger scales. And another place where kind of DAO patterns could come in handy, but also could learn from, are gaming guilds. So what are gaming guilds? And I still feel that they're probably the closest kind of requisite or kind of corollary to DAOs that have existed so far. So gaming guilds and massively multiplayer online games, they basically arise from players being able to set their own goals, loosely guided by the open game world narrative. So referred to in MMOs broadly as guilds, clans, or alliances, these groups average in size between 40 to 150 participants, and their goals could include defeating difficult enemies or constructing useful tools. And on the right here, we have some EVE Online Alliance kind of logos that they've created for themselves. One kind of infamous example is from EVE Online. A guild alliance basically decided to create a Titan-class warship. And so this was the kind of most intense, strongest warship in the game that had never been built before, but it was possible. But in order to build it, you had to do things like collect different materials, kind of get the blueprints, put it together, assemble it. But also you had to make sure that other alliances knew that you weren't constructing one because it could be easily sabotaged or planned against. And so it was not only kind of coordination to do something, but also coordination to have a kind of subterfuge element. And so this was a group of people working together who knew each other mostly online, coordinating a really, really complex task in a shared kind of open game world in relation to other people also working online. And so I think it's probably a lot to learn from there. I would definitely read this book called Virtual Economies that tells a little bit more about it. And another thing we can kind of learn from, given that gaming guilds are so important for DAOs, is how they use loot. So this became, after the essay, loot became a more common term in the space because of a popular NFT project with its name. But I think that there's a lot of patterns around how loot, or basically treasure items in open world games, are distributed that we can learn from. So often it can only be picked up in the aftermath of a battle. It could be a robe, a sword, armor. And loot items like can be more useful for some players than others. So as a mage, so a magic person, you're probably less likely to need a big axe or a kind of heavy armor because you prefer to not be kind of in direct melee battle. So not all items are equally valuable. And there's a particular affordance that's interesting in the World of Warcraft game, which has its kind of close ties to the Ethereum culture, is that loot cannot be transferred between players after it's been picked up. So you defeat a dragon, loot is dropped on the ground, you pick up some armor, but the armor isn't useful to you, and now you can't give it to anyone else forever. So due to these kinds of affordances, and every game has its own idiosyncrasy, the players adapt and develop certain strategies to deal with these affordances. So one of these related to the World of Warcraft limitation of loot being non-transferable was developed in the 90s called Dragon Kill Points. And DKP, it exists in a bunch of different games. But in the World of Warcraft, there's a guild called Leftovers that we'll look at specifically that use DKP in a particular way. So what DKP is, it acts as a kind of private money system, but it's separate from any existing currency in the game world. It's something kind of players create. And DKP are distributed to guild members based on their participation in raids. So raids are kind of group endeavors, or like a group coming together to slay a dragon, as the title suggests. And it's interesting, I won't go into too much detail, but basically with DKP, there's this great paper called Dragon Kill Points, a summary white paper from 2007. Really recommend reading it, it's not too long. But basically where players from the kind of Leftovers guild and server develop a system where basically all of the items were available and sorted, and every time you participated in a raid, you were awarded a certain amount of DKP, and you could choose to spend these DKP on items that were important to you. And it would be a kind of public auction. And so if there was a really kind of prestigious item you've been saving for, really good for your character, you could get it, but you have to spend those points. And then those points that you spend would be distributed to other players who participated in the raid. So it's a kind of actually zero-sum way to be able to have kind of public allocation of loot. And I would say that kind of not only DKP, but other guild patterns like autonomous dispute resolution. So many of these guilds who are distributing loot obviously have disputes sometimes, because this is really like a, I think a lot of people still think of games as kind of an unreality or something, but these environments are incredibly important to people participating in them and actually have a lot of real world value attached to them too. So the ability to autonomously resolve disputes, often without recourse to the legal system, but within guilds, just kind of having these dispute mechanisms is something that DAOs should learn from a lot, because there's things like Claros Court and a lot of dispute resolution tools in crypto that haven't reached maturity yet. And also thirdly, with the Leftovers DKP distribution system, particularly, there's a kind of market allocation of publicly owned goods. So the ability to do a kind of market socialism is really apparent in some guilds. And this could help with all these DAO dilemmas like reputation, which DKP solves based on participation. Also distribution, so basically how to resolve disputes, and also how to deal with trust, because guilds ultimately are high trust environments, because they don't have automation in the way that crypto aims to have automation. So we can learn from a lot of their cultural patterns and use them from the start. And they also introduced this kind of idea of what I call shadow economics. It's this kind of idea that an apt term for when a group operates through an economic form it might never label itself as. So despite being in a highly financialized space, DAOs might kind of start looking like digital cooperatives, and gaming guilds might start looking like they operate according to market socialism. But also both of these groups would probably be very unlikely to label themselves as such. So it's this kind of way for an ideology or an infrastructure or a kind of organizing pattern to be able to have a cultural and infrastructural foundation without getting a little bit hung up on the political terms around it, but just really focus on the experiment as a kind of subterfuge. And I like to quote this great tweet, we should be building organizing platforms owned by users and workers where it doesn't matter that someone tweets something that you might disagree with, but whether or not they're helping us reach concrete political objectives. So in the way that shadow economics basically allows us to think past ideological labels and actually kind of do certain experiments with people, I think forges new important political alliances that will be very important. And obviously this has its pitfalls and can go very wrong, but I think we're at a historical moment where DAO's ambiguity and ahistoricity, so the kind of lack of awareness of lineages, there's an opportunity for collaboration across existing divides and actually kind of taking some politics that may be less favorable and kind of incorporating and transforming them through the process. So what does that mean for the future? What are DAOs today and now after 2021? Since last year was a really big year for DAOs. So I would say that they'll not be the uniformly non-hierarchical networks some imagine. Instead, they'll coordinate across different levels of coherence and trust. So I roughly sketched like 3 layers of a DAO, although it could take any other form. So you could think of a DAO as having a kind of token, so multi-organizational network aligned by token ownership. And you can think of DAOs as having multiple teams, so teams, guilds, and squads represented by token ownership, and missions, milestones, and raids financed by token ownership. So from these layers, a hierarchical network emerges, meaning an organization that possesses the ability to be ranked in multiple ways. So rather than a kind of strictly hierarchical or non-hierarchical system, instead we get something where you could look at an ecosystem of DAOs, and you could see here you have DAO A, B, and C. And here highlighted the DAO B network, where you have teams, which are the triangles, circles, the token, and then kind of missions, raids, milestones. So from one perspective, in the ecosystem of DAOs, the DAO B looks like this one. But then you could look at the DAO C network, and it still draws from the same ecosystem of players, but with slightly different distributed ownership and objectives. So depending on which way you look at the network, it looks like a different hierarchical structure. So it's heterarchic. And from this, I think we have the main kind of promise, value prop, if you want to say, of DAOs, is that because programmable tokens can be distributed in a more granular way than traditional corporate interests, memberships, or shares, the possibility for a new type of token holder company formation comes to the fore. So an idea that you could have more granular expertise and governance rights very easily created, embedded, and programmable with an organization. This is like DAO's promise rather than what they are. And it is, there is one version of this where we just get shareholder capitalism that's less interesting, but there is still an opportunity to get a kind of tacit knowledge. So basically, for example, tacit knowledge means kind of lived experience knowledge and often implicit knowledge that you have from knowing how to do a process that might not be documented or explicit for others to know. My favorite incorporation of the idea of tacit knowledge is through the Regen Network and Regen Foundation. So Regen Network is a public blockchain for ecosystem services, basically allowing small landholders to try to issue credits around regenerative practices in order to sustainably keep their land. And from the start, Regen Network set aside 30% of their Regen tokens for land stewards, climate scientists, and other stakeholders to basically form community DAOs that participate in governance of the chain itself. So Regen Network is a proof of stake chain, meaning that there's validators that hold the Regen token. They process blocks, and then they also vote on governance decisions, whether it's upgrade to the network or the introduction of new ecosystem services style credits or financial assets. So this gives a meaningful, actually a vetoable amount of governance power of the whole network to things like indigenous initiatives, earth regenerators, a particular group, from the start. And I think that that incorporation of tacit knowledge is very promising, and a lot of good learnings will be generated from it. But there's also the idea of beyond token voting governance, which becomes very important. And so I would say that most DAOs began with token voting governance because it was a really easy way to do Sybil resistance. So the way to make sure that in a system like Ethereum, where accounts don't have unique identifiers, but not unique identities, you can create an infinite number of accounts and basically vote with all of them if you just do it based on account identity. Having a token allows you to be able to say, okay, we take a snapshot of this token at this time and vote. And so you can't do kind of double voting. So basically, because token voting makes it easy in a system without a kind of human readable identity, it became the norm. But this is obviously unideal. We get plutocracy as a kind of norm. A lot of bad patterns come from it. So while tokens can distribute governance rights, we should also move beyond token voting as the first solution to decision making. Instead, we can look to things like proof of personhood, proof of participation, retroactive public goods funding, and its mechanisms to combat vote buying or other issues. But I still feel like in my heart that tokens are in some sense a really new form of digital object that will take time to establish norms around. And we're really at the beginning of what tokens are. I don't think that they're necessarily, well, they're definitely not currency yet. And I don't think that that will necessarily be their kind of very explicit end game either. And so what is all this good for? Basically, we have gamer guilds, we have cooperatives using software, we have group chats, and people in DAOs and excited about DAOs look at this and they say, is this an entirely new organizational form in the history of human civilization? And it's really funny. And I think there's one level in which this is kind of like, yeah, maybe. And not to shill it too hard, but just I think we have a confluence of historical factors over the last couple of decades that are really kind of inherently new for how humans think and relate to one another. But having new infrastructure and ways of doing things doesn't necessarily produce new politics. That's still up to us. But I think it's really important to start taking these forms seriously, because a lot of people still don't. And it's this emergent organizational form with legitimate political relevance. And the longer that we don't take kind of internet native organizations seriously, the less effort we'll put into kind of, let's say, making sure that power is distributed equally in these networks, or power is distributed more widely. And things like the digital divide and internet access become much more fraught when you think of these as the kind of political basis for a lot of decisions that will be made in the future. So we have to legitimate them now so that legitimate kind of counteractions can be taken at the same time. To kind of give, I'll briefly read a close of my essay to give a kind of more speculative push to what DAOs look like in a political context. Yeah, so basically, to call attention to the Chimeric Term's failings at seriousness, many return to its misnomer. The A in DAO does not live up to its autonomous reference, while others like Adlene invoke political rather than the technical spirit of autonomy in DAOs. So I would say that while the term DAO remains poetically correct, in my opinion, you could propose an occasional replacement: decentralized avatar organizations. So such organizations would take their political stakes both lightly and heavily. And as Audrey Tang notes, the days of avatar politicians are already here. You could describe them as virtual beings that represent rally and advocate on behalf of political platforms. And when automation increases, they may even spawn their own political platforms. So this could look like a collectively managed cyborg like Lil Michaela, or an entire environment shaped by members like trust moving castles. So you can think of it like a Unity or Unreal environment that is determined by a group. And ultimately, these organizations will have collectively developed interoperable game worlds, engines, or virtual being mascots at their core, which co-create the culture around their members organize. And as is the case with massively multiplayer online games, DAOs are less technical protocols for governance and more high-stakes game worlds that interweave. And we could see something like a DAO versus pack even in the next 2 years. And rather thinking of these tools as just kind of software, technical infrastructure, and focusing on that, we have to do a kind of greater worlding process, a kind of more embedded physical, tangible reality as these connect to more tangible real world assets. So rather than thinking through them as just protocols for governance or fetishizing how they can coordinate, we should aim instead for not just running code, but a rough consensus and running worlds, because these are kind of ecosystems and worlding engines that might have more power when they start out than when they fade out, but are still important. And it might be just another kind of, in the same way that organizational forms that of the past, say the commune or other things that we projected onto, maybe something more of a trap than a way out, we still have to continue trying. That is our generational mandate. That's it. I'll share this presentation. It has some resources. You can read some of them. We have a blog where some of my writing is, if you want to follow it or read it. And basically a preview of the next sessions as we'll go over Zodiac, which are some tools that my team works on, but also some patterns around decentralized organizing. We started a kind of open wiki for them. And basically I'll just share some ideas about where I think DAO tooling will go in the future, but also because I believe that governance patterns and cultural norms are probably more important than the tooling, we'll look specifically at some of the norms that these orgs are creating and come up with some on our own.
Amazing. Kia, thank you so much. Such a beautiful introduction. And I want to give you a moment to maybe spend a little time in this doc that I just put in the Zoom chat where the Q&A is collecting. Kia shared the Gnosis Guild mirror blog, and earlier in the chat, I shared ourmachine.net, which is Kia's personal website, which has a bunch of really interesting ideas, including some that we may touch on, like memory, that will come up. So we're really grateful that Kia's with us for DAOs and Dragons. Thank you so much for this. We also have a brief in module 4 on rough consensus and running code that we might need to update to this idea of rough consensus and running worlds. So yeah, unfortunately, we only have about 10 minutes left. So I think that getting through all the Q&A is going to be tough. I suggested in the chat that perhaps we could do some commenting in the Google Doc itself to try to answer some of the questions we can't get to here, perhaps between Kia, myself, everyone who has thoughts on any of the questions, and Marvin, who's with us also from Gnosis Guild, and we're grateful to have with us. But Kia, are there any that stand out to you right now, and an approach you'd like to try to go through some of these rapid fire? Otherwise, I can point to some that stood out to me.
If you wouldn't mind highlighting some, I'm actually still reading through them. So
yeah, sure thing. Maybe to start from the bottom a bit, there are a few that stand out. One from Rich, and after this one, I might ask if people want to unmute themselves, but I'll actually start with CGS question first. She asked, what are your thoughts on DAOs with hierarchies based on need? For example, a constitution DAO probably only needed creative direction, so flat structure work, but what about like non-hierarchical DAOs where there's specific knowledge needed? How do you think about that?
yeah, so I think in the kind of rough model with the layers that I sketched, there's this idea of kind of having different guilds or teams that were part of the DAO. So I think there's many questions where you need something much more that looks much more like an expert committee. So you have expertise basically coming into a network and basically being able to advise or operationalize based on knowledge. So there's the expert committee model kind of blended with now a popular sub-DAO model. I think what is emerging as the kind of primary structure is this idea of the DAO being roughly aligned by token one governance space, but having multiple sub-teams with different expertise, whether it could be a marketing team, but it also could be a team that advises on particular type of carbon credits, say. So it could be both knowledge and craft-based. There's examples like this I just saw in the chat, obviously, of MakerDAO. MakerDAO has been really successful with a kind of core units model where there's different teams that have different functions in the ecosystem, and that those teams have relative autonomy and budget and operational processes, but then feed back into the overall DAO's objective. So I think this kind of notion as well with Orca, well, formerly known as Orca, now known as Metropolis, you have this idea of pods, so kind of small groups within DAOs that work together. I think this kind of model is definitely the most emergent and best one. It looks a little bit different from companies with departments because of autonomous budget, but also likelihood of these DAOs, guilds, teams to basically work with other DAOs as well in a relatively fluid model. So I definitely think why I use the term hierarchic is because basically, depending on what perspective or kind of standpoint you're looking at the organization from, you can see the hierarchy being in different ways. So if you're thinking about treasury management in terms of MakerDAO, there's core units that you would say like are greater in the hierarchy there. But if you're looking from a different perspective of, say, just collateralization, different core units have greater hierarchy and mandate. So it's a kind of fluid hierarchy, a kind of anarchic hierarchy that I think is emerging from the DAO sub-DAO model.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And Kate, can you tell me one thing? Do you have the extra 15 minutes if we have it?
Yeah, I think I do.
Okay. What we might do is take one more question here, and then for a small group that would like to hop over to Andy's Zoom room, Andy is here and he could take this Google Doc and you could continue Q&A in there, like a brief intermission and then continue in there if that's okay, because we have to use this Zoom room for another meeting, basically. But I'll leave the last question with at the beginning, and I'm being selfish here, but I really do think there's something here. You brought up these 8 imagined qualities of DAOs, and the last one was the mnemonic, and you spoke about DAOs as memory-making institutions, and perhaps you could expand upon why that's exciting to you.
Yeah, so it's I've been thinking about memory practices a lot. So the idea of basically how we pass different forms of knowledge or stories over time from different generations and through different mediums that hold them. And I think that there's like a real crisis at the moment where we view like software and digital technology as a like form of technology that's like separate from ourselves, or like basically when we say technology, often we mean like stupid platform apps, when really like technology is basically something that has persisted through kind of all of human history in terms of a kind of creation that humans make that interacts with the world. And if we start thinking of technology on a longer time span, and basically the goal of technology to be able to like encode and pass on and distribute memory, then this divide between like software and us today, we can think of it much more interwoven. So we can think of software as an attempt of us to kind of try to form different types of memory for humanity. So we have the like MySQL database, which is very like experientially boring way, but the way that, you know, this rush of cultural institutions to digitize all human knowledge and put it in a database, we can see kind of, we can read technology and like the ability of social platforms to produce memory in this light. And then we can also think of it in a more embodied sense, because does memory really live in this database? Does anyone know the kind of content there? Is it living? Will it actually pass to the next generation if like the 4 servers storing it are destroyed? So we then can think about how to activate software in more interesting ways, where we have things like database jewelers, or we think of this kind of active participation in the memory creation that it holds. So like things like DAO historians, and the way that basically all transactions of a DAO are in a huge public distributed database that anyone can look at. Like, what are the types of memory that that produces, and how do we activate them towards like a social groundedness? And also on the flip side, if we think about privacy, how do we have accountability for kind of civic organizations? And then how do we have kind of personal privacy, which I believe is really, really deeply important. And like, what is the form of memory? Where's the threshold of memory there in terms of accountability and privacy? So if we start thinking through DAOs as mnemonic institutions, we can think through what are the kind of social memories we want them to create, because they leave a huge trace, but also a trace that isn't necessarily useful for us right now.
Yeah, I could listen to you talk about this for hours. I'm gonna have to stay here for the next one. Perhaps give Kia a couple minutes to get into Andy's Zoom, and everyone who wants to continue with Q&A for 15 minutes, Andy will lead in there. Thank you, Kia, so much, and enjoy Q&A. Enjoy.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Keep going with Adventure Time here for anyone who's sticking around. Can you hear?